Welcome to Verified Crime Files. Thanks for the support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. And when you're done watching, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share. Thank you. We are taught from childhood to trust the uniform, the police badge, the firefighter's coat, the utility worker's bright yellow vest. It's called authority bias, a psychological shortcut that tells us to lower our guard. But on a crisp October morning in Michigan, two men used that trust as a weapon. They didn't break in, they were invited in. Hussein Murray opened his door to fix a gas leak that didn't exist. 11 minutes later, the workers were gone, and the basement was a tomb. This is the story of the 11 minutes that destroyed a family, and why you should never just open the door. The darkness of October in Michigan has a weight to it, a heavy, damp cold that settles over the suburbs of Rochester Hills long before the calendar turns to winter. On the night of October 10th, 2024, that darkness seemed to pool specifically around the front porch of the Murray residence on Newcastle Drive, concealing intentions that were far more chilling than the autumn wind. Inside, Hussein Sam Murray and his wife Linda were winding down, the quiet rhythms of a couple married for over 50 years filling the space. The soft hum of the television, the locking of doors, the comfort of a routine etched in half a century of shared history. But at 10 p.m., that rhythm was shattered by a sharp, unexpected rap on the front door. In a neighborhood known for its manicured lawns and safety, a late-night visitor is an anomaly, a breach of social contract that triggers an instinctual alarm. Linda moved to the door, peering out to see figures standing in the shadows, their forms obscured but their purpose allegedly official. They claimed to be from DTE Energy, the local utility giant, citing a gas leak that required immediate inspection. It was a classic Trojan horse, a lie wrapped in the urgency of public safety, designed to bypass the logical centers of the brain and trigger immediate compliance. However, survival instincts are often quieter than panic, whispering caution when the world demands action. Linda Murray, standing on the other side of that locked door, felt the friction between the lateness of the hour and the official story. Why would DTE come at 10 p.m. without a truck, without flashing lights, without the chaotic fanfare that usually accompanies a gas leak? She refused to open the door. She spoke through the barrier, her voice firm, denying them entry. It was a moment of victory, though she didn't know it yet. She had just bought her husband 12 more hours of life. The men on the porch, Carlos Hernandez and Joshua Zuazo, did not force the issue. They retreated into the night. Their first probe of the perimeter failed. They were not merely opportunistic burglars looking for an open window. They were hunters testing the fence line, gauging the resistance, and refining their strategy. As the sound of their footsteps faded, the Maïs likely returned to bed, unsettled but safe, unaware that the shadow on the porch had not dissipated, but merely lengthened, stretching out to wait for the sun to rise. The sun rose on October 11th, 2024, casting a deceptive normalcy over Rochester Hills. For Hussein Murray, the morning was not just the start of a day, but the continuation of a legacy he had built with his own hands. At 72 years old, Hussein was a pillar of his community, the owner of gold and glitter jewelry in Hamtramck, a business that was more than a store. It was a testament to the American dream. He dealt in precious metals, in the tangible weight of gold and the brilliance of diamonds, a trade that requires a unique blend of toughness and charm. He was known as a man of generosity, the kind of shopkeeper who knew his customers' names and their stories, a man who had navigated the complexities of business and life to reach a point of comfortable, well-earned success. Inside the home on Newcastle Drive, the morning coffee was brewed, the plans for the day were made, and the terror of the previous night's visit was likely rationalized away as a misunderstanding or a false alarm. The psychological defenses we build are strong. We refuse to believe that we are targets, preferring to inhabit a world where coincidences explain away danger. But the predators had not slept. They had adapted. At around 10 a.m., the knock came again. This time, the visuals were different. The darkness of the previous night was replaced by the bright, authoritative clarity of daylight. Hernandez and Zuazo had upgraded their disguise. They stood on the porch wearing high-visibility yellow vests, the universal uniform of the working class, a signal that says, "I am here to fix, not to harm." In their hands, they held a clipboard and upon it, a fabricated logo of DTE Energy. They had done their homework. They knew that in the light of day, with the props of authority, the skepticism that had saved the Mies the night before would be eroded. When Hussein Murray answered the door this time, he wasn't facing shadowy figures. He was facing a crew sent to address the very gas leak they had warned about. The lie had germinated overnight. Hussein, a man who had spent his life securing his jewelry store, who knew the look of a thief, was blind to this deception because it wore the mask of help. He made the decision that would end his life. He unlocked the door and stepped back, inviting the men across the threshold. The moment Carlos Hernandez and Joshua Zuazo stepped into the foyer of the Murray home, the dynamic of the house shifted instantly from a sanctuary to a crime scene. The invasion was silent, predicated on a psychological trick known as authority bias. We are conditioned from childhood to defer to uniforms, to trust the clipboard, to believe that the man in the safety vest knows something we don't. The imposters played this role to perfection. They didn't pull weapons immediately. They didn't scream or shout. Instead, they maintained the professional veneer of utility workers, likely apologizing for the intrusion, perhaps referencing the missed visit from the night before to create a continuity of narrative. "We just need to check the meter," they would have said, a phrase so mundane it renders the listener defenseless. Hussein, likely concerned for the safety of his home and his wife, became an unwitting participant in his own murder. He wasn't just letting them in, he was guiding them. The geography of the home now became a tactical map for the killers. They needed to separate the targets. A husband and wife together are a unit. They can communicate, they can fight back, they can witness. Separated, they are vulnerable. The gas leak ruse is the perfect mechanism for this separation. The gas meter is almost always in the basement, the most isolated, soundproof part of a home. Hernandez and Zuazo directed Hussein toward the basement stairs, a descent into the dark underbelly of the house. Linda remained upstairs, perhaps tidying up the breakfast dishes, perhaps listening to the heavy boots on the floorboards, trusting that her husband was handling the maintenance. She watched them disappear down the steps, the heavy door clicking shut or remaining slightly ajar, cutting the house in two. Upstairs, the light, the life, the wife. Downstairs, the concrete, the shadows, and the killing floor. The physical distance between them was only a flight of stairs, but in that moment, it became an infinite chasm that neither would ever cross again. The basement of a suburban home is a unique architectural space, often serving as the repository for the things we do not need daily, but cannot bear part with: archives of family history, seasonal decorations, and the mechanical organs that keep the house alive. As Hussein Murray led Carlos Hernandez and Joshua Zuazo down the wooden steps into this subterranean level, he was effectively walking out of the jurisdiction of the visible world and into a soundproof chamber designed by his own builders. The air in a basement always carries a different weight, cooler and stiller than the living quarters above, and in this context, that stillness was a weapon. Hussein, ever the diligent homeowner, likely believed he was participating in a routine inspection, perhaps pointing out the location of the gas lines or the furnace. His mind focused on the technical problem at hand. He was a man defined by helpfulness, by the civic duty of a good neighbor and a responsible citizen, traits that the imposters were banking on. Behind him, the two men were shedding their persona. The DTE workers who had smiled and nodded on the porch were evaporating in the dim light of the stairwell, replaced by the cold, kinetic energy of predators who had successfully corralled their prey into the kill box. The high-visibility vests, so bright and reassuring in the morning sun, now glowed with a sinister irony in the gloom, beacons of a safety that did not exist. The psychological shift in the room would have been palpable, the moment where the social contract snaps and the homeowner realizes, too late, that the guests are not there to help. The violence, when it came, was likely sudden, overwhelming, and brutally efficient. There is a terrifying asymmetry in an ambush. The victim is operating on a timeline of cooperation, while the aggressors are operating on a timeline of destruction. In the confined space of the basement, amidst the stored memories of a lifetime, the attack on the 72-year-old jeweler was not a fight. It was an execution of power. The autopsy and police reports would later indicate the brutality of the assault, but the narrative reality is even more chilling. Hussein was silenced before he could understand the totality of the betrayal. The gas leak was the MacGuffin, a fictional device used to lure a man away from the protection of his wife and the eyes of the street. In those terrible minutes, the basement transformed from a domestic space into a crime scene, the concrete floor absorbing the violence that would define the rest of the case. The perpetrators, Hernandez and Zuazo, had crossed the line from burglary to murder, a threshold that once crossed offers no return. They didn't just kill a man, they dismantled the head of a family, extinguishing 7 decades of life, experience, and love in a burst of targeted aggression, all while his wife stood just a few feet above their heads, separated by nothing more than floorboards and a tragic ignorance of the horror unfolding beneath her feet. Upstairs, the house held its breath. Linda Murray stood in the kitchen or the living room, suspended in the amber of a Tuesday morning that no longer existed. The silence of a house when others are present is a specific kind of quiet. It is an expectant silence, filled with the anticipation of returning footsteps or the murmur of voices drifting up through the floor. For Linda, the minutes that ticked by were heavy with a dissonance she couldn't yet name. She likely strained her ears to hear the clank of tools or the technical jargon of utility work, the comforting sounds of men fixing a problem. But the basement is a vault. It hoards its secrets. The absence of sound was not peaceful. It was heavy, a vacuum that began to pull at the edges of her subconscious. We often speak of women's intuition, but in high-stakes survival situations, it is often just the brain rapidly processing microdata, the duration of the visit, the lack of conversation, the stillness of the air, and signaling that the pattern is wrong. Linda was standing in the wreckage of her life, but the dust hadn't settled yet, so she couldn't see the ruin. She was a wife waiting for her husband, a role she had played thousands of times, unaware that she was now a widow waiting for his killers. The passage of time in a crisis is elastic. 5 minutes can feel like an hour, or an hour can vanish in a second. As Linda waited, the mundane objects of her home, the coffee cup, the mail on the counter, the sunlight hitting the carpet, became mockery. These were artifacts of safety that had already been violated. The psychological tension in this chapter of the story comes not from action, but from the lack of it. It is the slow burn horror of the meanwhile. While the viewer or reader knows the atrocity that has occurred just meters away, the protagonist is trapped in the innocence of the preceding moment. Linda may have checked the clock, wondering if she should offer the workers water or if she should call down to Sam to check on the progress. Every second she delayed going down those stairs was a second she remained alive, though she didn't know it. The decision to stay upstairs, grounded in the polite social norm of letting workers do their job without hovering, was the only thing standing between her and the immediate fate that befell her husband. The silence stretched, tight as a piano wire, until it finally snapped, not with a scream, but with the sound of the basement door handle turning, a sound that signaled the end of the waiting and the beginning of the nightmare. The sound of footsteps returning from the basement should have been a relief, the signal that the work was done and the intrusion was over. Linda Murray turned to face the door, her eyes expecting to see the familiar, reassuring silhouette of her husband, perhaps wiping dust from his hands, followed by the 2 utility workers. Instead, the visual data that greeted her was disjointed and terrifying. The door opened, and Carlos Hernandez and Joshua Zuazo emerged alone. The absence of Hussein Murray in that frame was a screaming void, a visual gap that shattered the reality of the morning. In that split second, the facade of the DTE workers completely dissolved. The men who walked back into the kitchen were not the polite, service-oriented employees who had asked to check a meter. Their posture had changed. The deferential slump of the service worker was replaced by the rigid, adrenaline-fueled stance of the aggressor. The masks were off, metaphorically, and the energy they brought into the room was jagged and cold. The high-visibility vests, once symbols of authority, were now just costumes in a grotesque play that had reached its climax. For Linda, the cognitive processing load in this moment would have been immense. The brain struggles to accept a paradigm shift of this magnitude instantly. The question, "Where is Sam?" likely formed on her lips, but the answer was written in the eyes of the men standing before her. They didn't offer a technical explanation about the gas line. They didn't offer a timeline for repairs. They closed the distance between themselves and the 72-year-old woman with a predatory speed that erased any lingering hope of a misunderstanding. This is the moment in a home invasion where the dynamic shifts from fraud to dominance. The ruse is discarded because it is no longer necessary. They have control of the environment. The horror for Linda was not just the threat to her own safety, but the dawning, crushing realization that if these men were here, and her husband was not, something catastrophic had happened in the dark beneath the floor. The reveal is the pivot point of the crime, the moment the soft skills of the con artist are swapped for the brute force of the thug. The pretense of the gas leak evaporated instantly, replaced by the raw, transactional motive of the crime: greed. The first words out of the impostors' mouths were not about safety or utilities, but about commodities. "Where's the jewelry? Where is the cash?" The demand confirmed the targeted nature of the attack. This was not a random burglary gone wrong. It was a calculated strike against the owner of gold and glitter jewelry. The perpetrators knew who Hussein was, they knew his business, and they had operated under the assumption that a jeweler brings his inventory home. The interrogation of Linda Murray was fueled by this specific intelligence, however flawed it might have been. The men were likely agitated, high on the adrenaline of the murder they had just committed and the pressure of the ticking clock. They needed the payout to justify the blood, and Linda became the vessel for that information. The terror of being interrogated in one's own kitchen by men who have likely just killed one's spouse is a specific kind of psychological torture. It strips the victim of the sanctity of their home, turning the kitchen table and the family photos into the backdrop of a hostage situation. Linda's reaction, tied to the survival instinct, was forced to bypass grief in favor of compliance. The men were aggressive, demanding access to a safe or a stash that they believed existed. This disconnect between the criminal's fantasy that a jeweler sleeps on a pile of diamonds and the reality of the victim's life creates a dangerous friction. If the victim cannot produce what the criminal imagines they have, the violence often escalates out of frustration. Hernandez and Zuazo, having already crossed the moral event horizon in the basement, had no brakes left to pump. They used verbal threats and physical intimidation to extract information, their voices likely rising in the quiet house, a harsh counterpoint to the suburban peace outside. For Linda, the interrogation was a negotiation for her life. She had to navigate the demands of two desperate men while processing the likely loss of her husband, a mental tightrope walk performed under the deepest duress imaginable. The men weren't looking for a gas leak. They were looking for the harvest of a lifetime of work, reducing the Murray family's existence to an equation of risk and reward. With the interrogation yielding whatever meager fruits it could, the perpetrators moved to the final stage of their containment strategy: physical incapacitation. They did not intend to take Linda Murray with them, nor did they intend to leave her capable of raising the alarm. Joshua Zuazo produced a roll of duct tape, a common household item that, in the context of violent crime, becomes a symbol of absolute control. The binding of a victim is a deeply intimate violation. It requires the aggressor to invade the personal space of the target, to manipulate their limbs, and to reduce a living, breathing human being to the status of a package. For Linda, this was the moment where the terror became tactile. The rough adhesive was wound around her wrists and ankles, the chemical smell of the glue mixing with the adrenaline in the air. The sensation of being bound is primal. It triggers a claustrophobic panic that overrides rational thought. As the tape tightened, it wasn't just restricting her movement. It was stripping away her agency, transforming her from the matriarch of her home into a helpless witness to her own tragedy. The psychological impact of this act on Linda cannot be overstated. She was forced into a position of submission in the very sanctuary where she should have been safest. The men worked with a hurried efficiency, their focus shifting from the extraction of wealth to the logistics of escape. They likely gagged her as well, or threatened her into silence, leaving her trapped in a terrifying isolation. Even if she could scream, who would hear? The walls of the suburban home, built for privacy, now served as the walls of a prison. As she lay there, bound and terrified, her mind would have been racing toward the basement. The silence from below was now deafening. The fact that these men were binding her, and not her husband, was the final, unspoken confirmation of the horror she feared. She was alive to be tied up. Sam was not. The duct tape was the physical manifestation of the separation that had begun when Hussein walked down those stairs, a crude, silver line drawn between the survivor and the deceased. The exit of the perpetrators was as jarring as their entry had been deceptive. Having secured the scene to their satisfaction, Hussein silenced in the basement, Linda immobilized upstairs, and whatever loot they could carry in their possession, Hernandez and Zuazo prepared to leave. The transition from the chaotic energy of the assault to the sudden vacuum of their departure is a distinct phase in home invasion narratives. They didn't run out screaming. They likely walked, maintaining the veneer of the workers for any neighbors who might be watching. They stepped out of the front door, back into the crisp October morning, the bright sunlight washing over them as if nothing had happened. They carried with them the spoils of a life destroyed, but they left behind something far heavier, the wreckage of a family. As the door clicked shut behind them, the house was plunged back into silence. Not the peaceful quiet of the morning, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a crime scene. For Linda, the sound of the door closing was both a relief and a new terror. The immediate threat of physical violence had walked out the door, but she was now alone with the aftermath. The sound of their vehicle, a white pickup truck with a flashing light, another prop in their theatrical con, fading down Newcastle Drive, marked the end of the event and the beginning of the survival. The men were gone, blending back into the traffic of Rochester Hills, disappearing into the grid of the city. They were ghosts who had materialized, destroyed, and vanished. Inside the house, the clock continued to tick. The normalcy of the neighborhood outside, the mailman, the dog walkers, the distant hum of lawnmowers, continued uninterrupted, a cruel juxtaposition to the nightmare that was sealed inside the walls of the Murray residence. The world had not stopped, but Linda's world had ended. Alone in the house, Linda Murray began the fight that defines the survivor, the struggle to reclaim agency. Bound by duct tape, her body aching from the stress and likely rough handling, she had to override the paralysis of trauma with the imperative of action. This is the part of the story where the human spirit exerts its will against physical constraints. She knew she had to reach a phone. She knew she had to get help for Sam. The physical mechanics of moving while bound are grueling, inching across the floor, straining against the adhesive, using furniture for leverage. Every movement would have been a battle against friction and pain. The desperation to check on her husband would have been the fuel driving her, a frantic hope that perhaps he was just injured, perhaps he was bound like her, waiting for release. The psychology of this struggle is focused entirely on the next step. Get to the phone, dial the number, speak. When she finally managed to access a phone, whether by freeing a hand or manipulating a device, the call to 911 was the lifeline she had clawed her way toward. The voice of the dispatcher on the other end was the first reconnection to the civilized world, the first thread of order re-entering the chaos. Her words would have been frantic, a mix of information and plea. They led him. She might have feared, or he's in the basement. That call set the gears of the emergency response system in motion. The dispatch went out. Home invasion. Person down. The sirens that began to wail in the distance were the cavalry coming too late to save the day, but just in time to witness the tragedy. Linda's struggle didn't end with the call. She had to wait those agonizing minutes for the police to arrive, lying in the house that had been violated, listening to the silence of the basement, and praying against the odds. The arrival of the Oakland County Sheriff's deputies brought a swarm of controlled chaos to Newcastle Drive. Officers breached the home, weapons drawn, clearing room by room, their shouts of police shattering the stillness. They found Linda distressed and bound, and immediately the focus split. Paramedics to the survivor, officers to the threat. But the threat was gone. The house was clear. The inevitable gravitation of the investigation pulled them to the basement door. It stood as a grim portal, the last place the husband was seen alive. As the deputies descended the stairs, their body cameras recording the descent, the atmosphere shifted from tactical clearance to crime scene preservation. The beam of their flashlights cut through the gloom of the basement, sweeping over the stored boxes, the furnace, and finally coming to rest on the victim. Finding Hussein Murray was the confirmation of the tragedy. He was found deceased, the victim of a brutal assault. The medical examiner would later detail the cause of death, but for the officers on the scene, the specifics were less important than the reality. A 72-year-old man had been murdered in his own home by men pretending to be helpers. The radio traffic would have changed tone, from rescue to homicide investigation. The basement became the epicenter of a forensic storm. Crime scene technicians would soon arrive to dust for prints, to photograph the body, to collect the microscopic debris left by the killers. Upstairs, the realization hit Linda with the force of a physical blow as the officer's demeanor changed, as the questions shifted, as the chaplain or victim advocate was called. The discovery was not just of a body. It was the discovery of a permanent absence. Sam was never coming back up those stairs. With the discovery of the body, the clock started on the manhunt. Homicide investigations are races against entropy. The longer the suspects are free, the colder the trail gets. However, in the digital age, it is nearly impossible to vanish completely. Detectives from the Oakland County Sheriff's Office immediately began pulling the electronic threads. They canvassed the neighborhood for Ring doorbell footage, gathering digital eyes that had watched the street. They found the white pickup truck with the flashing light on video. They saw the men in the vests. They tracked the vehicle's movements through the grid of traffic cameras and license plate readers that blanket modern cities. This wasn't Sherlock Holmes looking for cigar ash. This was big data hunting for a signal. The DTE disguise, while effective for the homeowner, was a unique identifier that helped police isolate the suspects in the video feed. The trail led them away from Michigan. Hernandez and Zuazo were running. They likely knew the severity of what they had done, or perhaps they didn't care, but they were moving fast. The investigation expanded, crossing state lines, involving federal agencies. The coordination between departments was critical. They tracked cell phone pings, the digital breadcrumbs that every modern fugitive drops. They identified Hernandez and Zuazo as the prime suspects. The net began to tighten. This was no longer a local burglary case. It was a multi-state priority. The manhunt chapter is a testament to modern policing technology, where the road itself watches you, and the phone in your pocket betrays your location. The suspects were driving south, perhaps thinking distance equals safety, unaware that their license plate had already flagged them as wanted men on screens hundreds of miles away. The chase ended not in a dramatic shootout, but in the calculated takedowns of two desperate men in two different locations. The lead imposter, Carlos Jose Hernandez, made it as far as Caddo Parish, Louisiana, over 1,000 miles from the crime scene. He was running deep. Try put the entire country between him and the basement in Rochester Hills. But the digital leash was too tight. On Saturday, just a day after the murder, law enforcement in Louisiana, acting on intelligence from Michigan, intercepted him. The arrest was swift. The man who had played the role of the confident utility worker was now in handcuffs. His flight terminated on a roadside in the south. Meanwhile, Joshua Zuazo didn't make it as far. He was apprehended in Plymouth Township, Michigan. The coordinated strikes dismantled the duo. The relief in the Rochester Hills community was palpable but muted by grief. The capture of the suspects didn't bring Sam back, but it stopped the fear that they would strike again. The booking photos of Hernandez and Zuazo, stripped of their high-vis vests, looking sullen and defeated, replaced the grainy surveillance images on the news. They were no longer the DTE imposters. They were defendants. The swiftness of the capture, within 48 hours of the crime, highlighted the efficiency of the task force, but also underscored the tragedy. The system worked perfectly to catch them, but it couldn't work fast enough to stop them. As the prosecutors built their case, the digital and physical evidence painted a damning portrait of premeditation. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of planning. The police uncovered text messages between Hernandez and Zuazo that read like a script for a heist movie, but with the chilling reality of real stakes. They discussed the DTE ruse explicitly. They talked about fabricating the signs, about buying the vests, about the hunt. The text revealed a predatory mindset where homeowners were viewed as licks or targets, not people. The gas leak story wasn't improv. It was a rehearsed play. Further evidence locked them to the scene. Cell phone tower triangulation placed their devices at the Murray home during the crucial 11-minute window. DNA evidence, likely recovered from the duct tape or the struggle in the basement, provided the biological link. The ancient document rule wasn't needed here. The digital footprint was fresh and undeniable. The prosecutors had a mountain of proof. The video of them entering, the video of them leaving, the text planning the disguise, and the stolen items. It was a deluge of facts that stripped away any potential defense of wrong place, wrong time. The evidence showed that they had scouted, they had targeted, and they had executed their plan with cold indifference to human life. The DTE worker disguise, their greatest weapon during the crime, became the strongest link in the chain of evidence against them. On December 9, 2025, the final chapter of the legal saga closed in an Oakland County courtroom. Carlos Jose Hernandez and Joshua Zuazo stood before a judge to hear their fate. The courtroom was likely packed with the Murray family, a sea of grief and anger. Linda Murray, the survivor who had endured the 11 minutes of terror and the months of loss, stood as a witness to justice. The legal process had been a second ordeal, reliving the trauma, seeing the faces of the men who killed her husband. But the verdict was decisive. There would be no leniency for those who weaponized trust. The judge sentenced both men to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It is the maximum penalty Michigan law allows, a sentence that ensures they will die in a concrete box, just as they left Hussein Murray to die in his concrete basement. The sentence brought a legal closure, a final period at the end of the court documents. But as the gavel fell, the reality of the story lingered. The Murray family left the courthouse with justice, but they went home to an empty house. The story of the DTE imposters serves as a grim cautionary tale for the modern age, a reminder that the uniform doesn't make the man, that trust must be verified, and that 11 minutes is all it takes for a lifetime of love to be stolen. The gold and glitter of Hussein's life was not in his store, but in the home he protected until his final breath. The story ends, but the lesson, don't open the door, remains etched in the psyche of a community that will never look at a utility vest the same way again. 2 life sentences were handed down, but justice cannot undo the silence in the Murray home. The DTE imposters are now behind bars, yet their crime leaves a chilling legacy on every front porch in America. The next time you see a clipboard and a vest through your peephole, remember Hussein Murray. Don't rely on the logo, rely on the phone call. Verify before you verify trust. If this story made you think twice about who you let in, share it with someone you love. It might just save their life. Stay safe, stay skeptical, and keep the door locked.